Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, according to PwC's insolvency barometer, insolvencies in Q1 2024 have increased by 41% on the same period last year. If this increased level of insolvencies continues, Ireland could record 1,000 insolvencies this year. So what is causing the surge? Well, Ken Tyrrell is a business recovery partner with PwC, and he joins us now to give us the answer. Ken, why do you expect to see close to 1,000 business insolvencies in Ireland this year?
Yeah, when we look at the kind of Q1 numbers that are just in, they've picked up quite a bit from last year. They're up 41% on the same quarter last year. And if you run that through the rest of 2024, it's probably looking like it's going to approach 1,000. By comparison, last year there was 717 insolvencies. So it would look like we're on track for somewhere between 900 to 1,000 for the rest of 2024.
Earlier this week, it was reported that over 200 restaurants, cafes and other food-led businesses have closed across Ireland so far this year, with an estimated annual loss to the economy of €288 million. So is the hospitality sector the major reason for the increasing insolvency rate?
Probably the most prominent sector over the last couple of years. And if we look even just at Q1, there was 45 companies within hospitality that failed. The second was retail with 44. But actually, if you look deeper into the numbers, when you look at the per 10,000 rate, hospitality was 25 per 10,000, whereas retail was only 8 per 10,000. So hospitality being 3 times worse than retail. So we are seeing the most pressure within hospitality of all the sectors we track. And that would be a trend we've seen over the probably last 18 to 24 months.
Apart from the liquidations, have you any idea how many businesses are out there looking for rescue?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're always trying to track to see what sort of cohort we believe may be in distress and need some form of restructuring. Going back a couple of years, we would have done some research to look at the kind of how successful the government supports were during COVID. And our research showed about 5,000 businesses had been saved from insolvency due to the kind of government supports and subsidies that were put in place. Now, if you kind of roll it on at the moment, the best barometer people are looking at is actually the debt warehousing. And if you look at that, there's about 50,000 businesses are in that debt warehousing. But if you really look at the kind of higher end of that, there's 5,000 businesses owe on average 280,000. So I think there's somewhere in that region of 5,000 businesses is probably the ones we're seeing of the total population that need some form of restructuring. The central bank did some research last year and kind of came around a number of 5,000 to 10,000. So that feels to be looking at a couple of different sources, the number of companies that may be in distress in the coming years.
On those 5,000 businesses that have relatively high levels of debt warehousing with the revenue, how flexible are the revenue being with them in terms of a timeline to repay that debt?
I think the revenue's position has probably softened a bit over the last year and a half. Initially, they would have been looking for an upfront payment from those businesses and then reach an installment plan, probably more over 3 years. In recent months, the revenue have kind of given a little bit more leeway on that, and they're less so looking for the upfront payment. In fact, they're only looking for just to technically set up the system, €1. And then it seems like they're more moving towards kind of a 5-year or even a bit beyond that. And I think once we get past the 1 May deadline and everybody sees what's there and what hasn't been agreed, so what number of businesses haven't reached a phased payment agreement, we might then see the final position of are they going to kind of stretch some of this more troublesome debt over potentially 7 or 10 years. That hasn't been said yet, but I would anticipate if there is going to be a cohort of businesses that just can't reach that agreement, and the choice for the revenue will be, does it want to stretch those out or does it want to enforce on those? And I don't think it does.
And with the revenue showing a level of flexibility with these businesses, and as well as that, lots of media attention being drawn to the fact that the numbers in terms of GDP for the economy are quite strong. People may be wondering, how is it that businesses are complaining out there, and how is it that so many businesses could be deemed to be in trouble financially? Is much of this down to the fact that multinational companies in Ireland are masking an underlying problem?
It's a big question, and it's probably looking at what we're seeing in terms of that. Like, if we're looking at 5,000 businesses, that's out of a total population of 300,000 businesses. So it is a kind of a relatively small cohort of the total amount of companies in Ireland that are probably in that, and that's probably a natural state of distress. But in terms of if we look at one sector, even if we looked at hospitality, what we're seeing emerging is kind of a couple of tiers within hospitality. So you've got the kind of large hotels that are performing very well. You've got the regional hotels and kind of mid-tier hotels that are either doing well as hotels or are providing refugee accommodation. And then where we're seeing the real problem is the kind of smaller, the cafes, the restaurants are the ones kind of facing the most distress at the moment. But just to put it again back into context, if we do have 1,000 insolvencies this year, by historic terms, over 20-year focus, that's still a relatively small number of insolvencies, as opposed to kind of back coming out of the global financial crisis, that would have been 2,500, 3,000. So we're still, although there's a pickup, we're coming from a pretty low level.
Is this somewhat of an overhang from COVID as well as this increase in costs?
Absolutely. I think it's the current cost pressures, and it's that aligned with also the legacy debts, be it creditors were very patient, be it the revenue commissioners, be it lenders, be it general trade creditors, but the debt didn't go away. So the debt is sitting on a lot of businesses, their balance sheets, and they don't have any flexibility then when the cost pressures, as I say, are coming through at the moment. There's not much wiggle room in terms of using the balance sheet to kind of trade through that period. So a lot of business owners have a massive focus at the moment on cash. As one of the things we talked to a lot of businesses about, it's really about you have to be really good now at cash flow forecasting. And cash flow forecasting is trickier now than it was, say, 5 years ago, because the variables, inflation, costs, the interest rate on refinances are a lot trickier to kind of model through. So people are really focused on cash, but actually at the same time forecasting is getting harder to do as well.
And just at that point then, Ken, how open are the banks to cash flow lending today? And then secondly, what's the appetite amongst these SMEs to actually undertaking this lending?
A lot of entrepreneurs have been through the last recession and are quite adverse to debt. So a lot of SMEs would trade without debt, and it's not actually debt that's the issue. It's just the underlying profitability. Back to that point of cost pressures coming through and being able to trade. I think the banks are open for business, but it's a little bit more restrictive now, because when you look at the cash flows, which determines ultimately how open banks are going to be to cash flow lending, the cash flows have to make sense themselves. And if businesses are coming under pressure with their cost base, and there's tighter margins, and there's a softening kind of consumer demand, and there is a softening consumer demand due to the kind of higher mortgage costs and general inflation, that tightens down the available cash flow that's available to repay lenders. But what we're seeing on the banks in terms of distress and enforcement, they're actually very patient. Their numbers have been very consistent over the last couple of years, very low levels of enforcement. So the banks are very much working through anything they have with borrowers. I think the challenge is going to come when it comes up to a refinance after a 3 or 5 year term and your interest rates are higher. It's the capacity then of businesses, can they meet those kind of higher interest rates costs going forward.
You mentioned about the 5,000 businesses that are carrying the highest burden of warehouse debt. What sectors are most exposed in that respect?
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting. Hospitality, retail and construction are carrying over 50% of that total warehouse debt. So we're seeing kind of they mirror each other in terms of they're the areas we're seeing the most insolvencies, and they're also the three largest parts of the debt warehousing.
And Ken, were you surprised to see the construction sector appearing in both of those stats?
There's obviously been a lot of cost inflation, and then it's up to construction companies to see what they can pass on ultimately to their clients. So it's been consistent again over the last 2 or 3 years. They're the three sectors that have been up there. It's similar to the UK. Construction actually in the UK is in a bit of a worse position than Ireland. So it's not too surprising to us that we see construction, albeit it's a little bit behind hospitality and retail in terms of the levels of distress in Ireland at the moment.
And for businesses that are struggling to repay the warehouse debt to revenue, or maybe aren't engaging with revenue regarding it, there is an important deadline looming for organisations that wish to agree a repayment plan with revenue, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a 1 May deadline, and it is really important because the interest rate was reduced to 0% if you can reach a phased payment agreement with the revenue. But if you don't do that, it's actually very penal. It goes to 8 or 10%, and also the revenue will have the right to call in that debt. So it's really not a position you would like to be in as a business. So there's a big urge, and we're just kind of pushing people to just get that engagement with the revenue and see what kind of terms are offered in terms of a phased payment agreement and reach that deal to prevent the kind of the worst case scenario of penal interest rates on the warehouse debt.
And Ken, finally, what advice do you have for business owners today that might be worried about the future viability of their business?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. I think one of the big things at the moment is cash flow forecasting. So, I mean, you can look at the past and you can be doing your management accounts, but it's really looking to the future now and kind of doing your kind of viability analysis. So, like doing your budgets for the year ahead and then putting it through a cash flow and just making sure there's an ability to pay debts as they fall due and doing that. So I think it's the kind of forward-looking aspect of that, doing your budgeting and your cash flow forecasting. That's something we'll be talking to a lot of our clients about. I think that's the big area of focus at the moment.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Ken Tyrrell from PwC, and I'd like to thank Ken for sharing this data with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.